Is blues music older than jazz?
Only slightly, and only if your definition of jazz doesn't include ragtime. Really, the two musical traditions developed side by side, with blues emerging about the first decade of the 1900s and hitting the height of its early popularity in 1920s Harlem, where the songs were seen as an expression of African American life. Great blues singers like Ma Rainey, 1886 to 1939, and Bessie Smith, 1894 or 1898 to 1937, sang of the black reality determined but weary. During the Harlem Renaissance, the music was a symbol for African American people who were struggling to be accepted for who they were. Poet Langston Hughes, 1902 to 1967, saw the blues as a distinctly black musical genre, and as helping to free blacks from American standardization. As the first person to codify and publish blues songs, American musician and composer W. C. Handy, 1873 to 1958, is considered the father of the blues. The Florence, Alabama, native produced a number of well-known works, including Memphis Blues, St. Louis Blues, which is one of the most frequently recorded songs in popular music, Beale Street Blues, and Careless Love.
When was the Bible translated into English?
The earliest English-language translations of any part of the Bible first appeared around the 8th century. The Vespasian Psalter was a primitive English translation of the Latin text of the Book of Psalms, but the Latin translation of the Bible, called the Vulgate, continued to prevail for several centuries as the version authorized by the Roman Catholic Church. It was not until the 1300s that the first comprehensive translation into English was undertaken by the controversial religious reformer John Wycliffe, c. 1330 to 1384. Wycliffe, an English theologian and professor at Oxford University, was a forerunner of the Protestant Reformation. He believed that all authority, religious and secular, can be derived only from God, and he attacked the worldliness of the medieval church. In 1377, Pope Gregory XI, 1329 to 1378, accused Wycliffe of heresy, but the reformer escaped trial. Nevertheless, he spent the rest of his life under the watchful eye of the Church, which did everything in its power to curtail Wycliffe's activities, eventually forcing him to retire. He managed to initiate the first complete translation of the Bible, which was finished by his followers. As an early leader of the Reformation, the Anglican priest William Tyndale, c. 1494-1536, believed that the scriptures needed to be available to everyone, not just the scholarly or learned. So he began translating the New Testament and the Pentateuch, the first 5 books of the Old Testament: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy, from Greek and Hebrew into English. He also referred to his friend Martin Luther's, 1483–1546, German translation of the Bible. But Tyndale was unable to get his English translation published at home in England, where the Anglican Church was determined to seize the work. In 1524 he fled the country for Germany, where he worked for the next 5 years to get his translations into print. Copies of it were smuggled back into England. Eventually he was arrested in Antwerp, Belgium, and condemned for heresy by the Roman Catholic Church. Tyndale was burned at the stake in 1536. His version later became the chief basis for the King James Version of the Bible, 1611.
Did the Cold War ever get hot?
After World War II, 1939–45, an intense rivalry developed between so-called Eastern Bloc countries, made up of the Communist Soviet Union and its allies, and the Western Bloc countries, the United States and its democratic allies. Though mutual suspicion, distrust, and fear ran deep on both sides of the conflict, the Cold War, 1947–89, never resulted in fighting. It never became hot. But both sides nevertheless prepared for that possibility by strengthening military alliances and developing and stockpiling weapons. The Cuban Missile Crisis, 1962, was probably the closest the Cold War came to getting hot.
Did Aristotle develop his own philosophy?
A student of Plato's for 20 years, Aristotle's ideas were unquestionably influenced by his teacher. However, Aristotle developed his own doctrine, which he applied to many subjects. Aristotle rejected Plato's theory of forms, or theory of ideas. While Aristotle, too, believed in material, the physical being, and forms, the unchanging truths. Unlike his teacher, he believed that it is the concrete, material, that has substantial being. Aristotle viewed the basic task of philosophy as explaining why and how things are, or how they become what they are. It is for this reason that Aristotle had not only a profound and lasting influence on philosophy but on scientific spirit.
How did the novel develop?
Critics and scholars agree that it is French writer Gustave Flaubert, 1821–1880, who developed the modern novel into a conscious art form. Flaubert's Madame Bovary is recognized for its objective characterization, irony, narrative technique, and use of imagery and symbolism. American writer, and naturalized British citizen, Henry James, 1843–1916, is acknowledged for having enlarged the scope of the novel, introducing dramatic elements to the narrative. developing point of view technique, and advocating realism in literature. James's works include The American, 1877, Daisy Miller, 1879. The Portrait of a Lady, 1881, and The Ambassadors, 1903. Irish writer James Joyce, 1882–1941, considered the most prominent English-speaking literary figure of the first half of the 20th century, is often credited with redefining the modern novel. Joyce experimented with the form and revolutionized it through his first novel, A Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, 1916, and with his masterpiece, Ulysses, 1922, in which he developed the techniques of interior monologue and stream of conscious narrative. Writer William Faulkner, 1897–1962, was the American counterpart to Joyce's experimentation with the form of the novel. The author of The Sound and the Fury, 1929, Light in August, 1932, and Absalom, 1936, among others. Faulkner, in his acceptance speech for the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1949, stated that the fundamental theme of his fiction is the human heart in conflict with itself. This he explored by employing a variety of narrative techniques, which, like Joyce's, departed radically from traditional methods.
What is contract bridge?
It's the game most people play when they play bridge. A card game for 4 players in 2 partnerships who bid to name the trump suit. The other kind of bridge is called auction bridge, which was invented in 1904 as a variation on the card game whist. Whist had been played since the early 16th century, if not longer. Auction bridge differs from contract bridge in that tricks made in excess of the contract are scored toward game. In contract bridge they are not. It's believed that contract bridge originated in 1926 when railroad heir and yachtsman Harold S. Vanderbilt, 1884–1970, invented the variation while on a Caribbean cruise. The game did not catch on until 1930, when Romanian-American contract bridge expert Eli Culbertson defeated Lieutenant Colonial W.T.M. Butler in a challenge match at London's Almack's Club. The match was highly publicized.
What was the Warsaw Pact?
The Warsaw Pact was the Eastern Bloc countries' answer to the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO. Seeing the Western nations form a strong alliance, in May 1955 the Soviet Union and its allies met in Warsaw, Poland, where they signed a treaty agreeing that they, too, would mutually defend one another. The 8 member nations were Albania, which withdrew in 1968, Bulgaria, Czechoslovakia, East Germany, Hungary, Poland, Romania, and the Soviet Union. The Warsaw Pact was headquartered in Moscow and, in addition to discouraging attacks from Western Bloc/NATO countries. The organization also sought to quell any democratic uprisings in Warsaw Pact nations. But in 1990 the pact and the Soviet Union's control of it weakened. As democracy movements in member nations could not be put down. As the former Eastern Bloc countries underwent relatively peaceful revolutions. Warsaw Pact members began announcing their intentions to withdraw from the organization. East Germany withdrew when it was reunified with West Germany. And the restored Germany joined NATO, in 1990. The Warsaw Pact was dissolved by the remaining member nations in 1991.
When did the Sunni and Shia sects of Islam form?
It was during the 600s, not long after Muhammad's death. When Muslims split into two main divisions, Sunni and Shia. Sunnite Muslims, who account for most of the Islamic world today, believe that Islamic leadership passes to caliphs. Temporal and spiritual leaders, who are selected from the Prophet Muhammad's tribe. The Shiites believe, however, that the true leaders of Islam descend from Ali, c. 600 to 661, Muhammad's cousin and the husband of Muhammad's daughter, Fatima. Called the Shining One, c. 616 to 633. Ali, who was the fourth caliph, 656 to 61. Is revered by Shiites as the rightful successor to the Prophet Muhammad and are led by his descendants. Shiites form the largest subgroup, but there are other sects within Islam as well. The Wahhabi Muslims are a puritanical sect, the Baha'is emerged from the Shiites. And the Ismaili Khoja Muslims have been in existence almost from the beginning of Islam. While Islamic practices may vary somewhat among the sects, all Islamic people uphold the 5 pillars of faith.
What happened at Normandy?
Normandy, a region in northwestern France that lies along the English Channel, is known for the June 6, 1944, arrival of Allied troops, which proved to be a turning point in World War II, 1939–45. Officially called Operation Overlord, but known historically as D-Day, and headed by General Dwight D. Eisenhower, 1890–1969, of the United States. The initiative had been in the planning since 1943 and it constituted the largest seaborne invasion in history. After several delays due to poor weather, the Allied troops crossed the English Channel and arrived on the beaches of Normandy on the morning of June 6. Brutal fighting ensued that day, with heavy losses on both sides. At the end of the day, the Allied troops had taken hold of the beaches, a firm foothold that would allow them to march inland against the Nazis, eventually pushing them back to Germany. While it was a critical Allied victory, which history has treated as the beginning of the end for German Chancellor and Führer Adolf Hitler, the invasion at Normandy was still to be followed by 11 more months of bloody conflict. Germany would not surrender until May 7 of the following year.
What was the Bill of Rights of 1689?
The English Bill, accepted by King William III, 1650–1702. Who ruled jointly with his Protestant wife Queen Mary II, 1662–1694, seriously limited royal power. After a struggle between the Stuart kings and Parliament and the subsequent ousting of King James II. 1633–1701, Parliament presented the Bill of Rights to King William and Queen Mary as a condition of their accession. The document not only described certain civil and political rights and liberties as true, ancient, and indubitable, but it also ironed out how the throne would be succeeded. This point was of critical importance to the future of England. The article stipulated that no Roman Catholic would rule the country. Since the Bill of Rights served to assert the role of Parliament in the government of England, it is considered one of the seminal documents of British constitutional law.
What were Napoleon's 100 days?
The term refers to Napoleon Bonaparte's last 100 days as ruler of France. Having been defeated by his enemies, a coalition of European powers, Britain, Sweden, Austria, and Prussia, who aligned themselves against Napoleon's domination, the emperor abdicated the throne in the spring of 1814. And was exiled to the island of Elba in the Mediterranean Sea. There he heard of the confusion and discontent that came after he had descended the throne. He left Elba, and with more than 1,000 men, arrived on the French coast at Caen and marched inland to Paris. Hearing of his arrival, the new Bourbon king, Louis XVIII, 1755–1824, fled. On March 20 Napoleon began a new reign, but it was only to last until the European allies defeated him again. At the Battle of Waterloo, June 12–18. After that battle, the so-called Little Corporal, for his diminutive stature, was permanently exiled to the British island of St. Helena, where he remained until his death in 1821.
Who were the Lombards?
The Lombards, too, were a Germanic tribe. They are believed to have originated on an island in the Baltic Sea. In the last century BC, the Lombards moved into Germany and gradually continued southward so that by AD 500, they were settled in present-day Austria. From 568 to the mid-700s, they controlled much of Italy, posing a serious threat to the papal supremacy, so that in 754, Pope Stephen II, d. 757, appealed to the powerful Franks for help. By this time the Franks were ruled by Pepin III, called Pepin the Short, c. 714 to 768, who was able to defeat the Lombards. The northern region of Italy, Lombardy, is named for them.
What innovations are credited to Virgil?
Scholars acclaim Virgil, 70 to 19b. c. for transforming the Greek literary traditions, which had long provided Roman writers with material, themes, and styles. Virgil populated his pastoral settings, always idealized by other writers. With contemporary figures, he combined observation with inquiry, employed a more complex syntax than had been in use previously, and developed realistic characters. These technical innovations informed all subsequent literature. However, writing was not supposed to have been Virgil's occupation, in his youth. He studied rhetoric and philosophy, and he planned to practice law, but proved too shy for public speaking. So he returned to the small family farm his mother and father operated, where he studied and wrote poetry. In addition to the Aeneid, Virgil wrote eclogues, or bucolica, a set of 10 pastoral poems written from 42 to 37 BC, as a response to the confiscation of his family's lands. And Georgics, a 4-volume work, written from 36 to 29 BC, glorifying the Italian countryside. Within 50 years of his death in 19 BC, Virgil's poems became part of the standard curriculum in Roman schools, ensuring the production of numerous copies. Virgil's works have remained accessible to scholars and students ever since.
When was public broadcasting started?
In the United States it was started in 1967, when the Public Broadcasting Act was signed into law by President Lyndon Johnson. 1908 to 1973, on November 7. Creating a corporation for public broadcasting to broaden the scope of non-commercial radio and TV beyond its educational role. Within 3 years, and as a result of federal grants, plus funds from foundations, business, and private contributions, Public Broadcasting Service, PBS, rivaled the big three networks, NBC, CBS, and ABC, for viewers. In England the British Broadcasting Corporation, BBC, took control of the development of television in 1932, launching BBC TV. The BBC had been founded as a radio broadcaster in 1922 under the leadership of English engineer John Charles Reith, 1889 to 1971. Reith remained at the helm of the BBC for 16 years after its founding, and under his guidance, it became one of Britain's most revered institutions, supported by the public with license fees.
How did the American tobacco industry get started?
Tobacco, a member of the nightshade family, is an indigenous American plant. When Christopher Columbus, 1451–1506, arrived in the West Indies in 1492, he found the native inhabitants smoking rolls of tobacco leaves, called tino. The word tobacco is derived from the Spanish tabaco, which is probably from tino. The practice of drinking smoke was observed to have a relaxing effect. Upon returning to Spain, Columbus took seeds of the plant with him. By 1531 tobacco was being cultivated on a commercial scale in the Spanish colonies of the West Indies. In 1565 English naval commander John Hawkins, 1532–1595, introduced tobacco to England, where smoking was condemned as a vile and stinking custom by King James I, 1566–1625, decades later. Tobacco was not commercially cultivated on the North American mainland until English colonist John Rolfe, 1585–1622, carried seeds from the West Indies to Jamestown, Virginia, where he settled in 1610. By 1612 he had successfully cultivated tobacco and discovered a method of curing the plant, making it a viable export item. Jamestown, Virginia, became a boomtown, and England's King James, who collected export duties, changed his mind about the habit of smoking. The coastal regions of Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina were soon dominated by tobacco plantations, and the crop became the backbone of the economies in these colonies. Cultivation of tobacco did not require the same extent of land or slave labor as did other locally grown crops such as rice and indigo, but it depleted the nutrients of soil more rapidly, causing growers to expand their lands westward into the Piedmont region, the plain lying just east of the Blue Ridge and Appalachian Mountains. In 1660 British Parliament passed the Second Navigation Act, declaring that tobacco and other articles from England's American colonies could only be exported to the British Isles. Tobacco prices dropped in response to the legislation, and the colonial economies were weakened, causing political discontent with the mother country. But European demand was not diminished, and the colonists soon resumed exports, despite the Second Navigation Act. By 1765 colonial exports of tobacco were nearly double in value the exports of bread and flour. The crop helped define the plantation economy of the South, which prevailed until the outbreak of the American Civil War, 1861–65. During the 1800s companies such as R.J. Reynolds Tobacco and American Tobacco were founded. Despite the highly publicized dangers of using tobacco, smoking or chewing, tobacco has remained an important crop, and the manufacture of tobacco products an important industry in the American South.
What are blue laws?
The term blue laws refers to laws that are intended to enforce moral conduct. They originated in colonial times in Puritan New England, and got the name because they were printed on blue paper. Some blue laws prescribed proper conduct for the Sabbath, which included no working, sports, or drinking. The early blue laws of New Haven, Connecticut, were widely publicized in a 1781 book, A General History of Connecticut. The author, Samuel Peters, 1735–1826, took some freedoms with the text. However, and even invented a few laws of his own. Since blue laws violate individual freedoms, most of them have been repealed through the years. If a community still has blue laws on its books today, they are not likely to be enforced. James Iredell. Jay's was an impressive resume. By the time of his appointment, he had been a member of the Continental Congress, over which he presided as president in 1778 and 1779, served as U.S. Minister to Spain. 1779, during the American Revolution, and joined American statesman Benjamin Franklin. 1706 to 1790, and the rest of the American Peace Commission in Paris, in 1782, to draw up the treaty ending the war with Britain. Once the new republic was established, Jay remained at the fore. He became President Washington's Secretary of Foreign Affairs, 1784–89, and, along with Alexander Hamilton, 1755–1804, and James Madison, 1751–1836, authored the Federalist, 1787–88, which explained the Constitution for the benefit of the states as they considered ratification.
What caused the Vietnam War?
In the simplest terms, the long conflict in Southeast Asia was fought over the unification of Communist North Vietnam and non-Communist South Vietnam. The two countries had been set up in 1954. Prior to that, all of Vietnam was part of the French colony of Indochina. But in 1946, the Vietnamese fought the French for control of their own country. The United States provided financial support to France. But the French were ultimately defeated in 1954. Once France had withdrawn its troops, an international conference was convened in Geneva to decide what should be done with Vietnam. The country was divided into two partitions, along the 17th parallel. This division of land was not intended to be permanent. But the elections that were supposed to reunite the partitions were never held. Vietnamese President Ho Chi Minh, 1892–1969, took power in the north while Emperor Bao Dai, 1913–1997, for a while, ruled the south. But the communist government in the north opposed the non-communist government of South Vietnam and believed the country should still be united. The North Vietnamese supported anti-government groups in the south and over time stepped up aid to those groups. These communist-trained South Vietnamese were known as the Viet Cong. Between 1957 and 1965, the Viet Cong struggled against the South Vietnamese government. But in the mid-1960s, North Vietnam initiated a large-scale troop infiltration into South Vietnam. And the fighting became a full-fledged war. China and the Soviet Union provided the North Vietnamese with military equipment, but not manpower. The United States provided both equipment and troops to non-communist South Vietnam in its struggle against the Viet Cong and North Vietnam. By 1969 there were more than 500,000 American troops in South Vietnam. This policy was controversial back in America, where protests to involvement in the Vietnam War continued until the last U.S. troops were brought home in 1973. In January of that year, the two sides had agreed to a ceasefire, but the fighting broke out again after the American ground troops left. On April 30, 1975, South Vietnam surrendered to North Vietnam and the war, which had lasted nearly 2 decades, ended. North Vietnam unified the countries as the Socialist Republic of Vietnam. For its part, the North Vietnamese called the conflict a war of national liberation. They viewed the long struggle as an extension of the earlier struggle with France. They also perceived the war to be another attempt by a foreign power, this time the United States, to rule Vietnam.
What impact did the Crusades have on Western Europe?
The goals of the Crusades were not accomplished. The Holy Land had been recovered, but Christians were unable to keep control of it. And while the Western Europeans had joined with the Eastern, Byzantine, Christians in their fight against the Muslims, the two groups remained bitter toward each other, which likely contributed to the fall of Byzantium to the Ottoman Turks in 1453. Nevertheless, the Crusades had a lasting effect on the European economy. During the expeditions, trade routes were established, new markets opened, and shipbuilding was improved. Having fortified themselves for the fight, the Christian monarchies in Western Europe emerged from the Crusades in 1291 as strong as if not stronger than before Pope Urban had first rallied the troops in 1095.
What are the elements of Japanese kabuki?
The most popular traditional form of Japanese drama, kabuki, features dance, song, mime, colorful costumes, heavy makeup, and lively, exaggerated movements to tell stories about historical events. The drama had its beginnings in 1575 when Okuni, a woman, founded a kabuki company. In 1603 at Kyoto, women danced at the Kitani Shrine, playing men's roles as well as women's. In October 1629 kabuki became an all-male affair by order of the shogun Iemitsu, who decided that it was immoral for women to dance in public. Just as in Elizabethan England, women's roles were then performed by men. The performing art became increasingly popular during the 1600s, eclipsing bunraku. Puppet theater, in which a narrator recites a story, which is acted by large, lifelike puppets. Today kabuki remains a viable art form, borrowing from other forms of drama to adapt to changing times.
What happened at Pearl Harbor?
On the night before the attack, the Japanese moved a fleet of 33 ships to within 200 miles of the Hawaiian island of Oahu, where Pearl Harbor is situated. More than 300 planes took off from the Japanese carriers, dropping the first bombs on Pearl Harbor just before 8 a.m. on December 7. 1941. There were 8 American battleships and more than 90 naval vessels in the harbor at the time. 21 of these were destroyed or damaged, as were 300 planes. The biggest single loss of the day was the sinking of the battleship USS Arizona, which went down in less than 9 minutes. More than half the fatalities at Pearl Harbor that infamous December day were due to the sinking of the Arizona. By the end of the raid, more than 2,300 people had been killed and about the same number were wounded. Pearl Harbor forever changed the United States and its role in the world. When President Franklin D. Roosevelt 1882 to 1945, addressed Congress the next day, he called December 7 a date which will live in infamy. The United States declared war against Japan. And on December 11 Germany and Italy, Japan's Axis allies, declared war on the United States. The events of December 7 had brought America into the war, a conflict from which it would emerge as the leader of the free world. When did the first U.S.
What was the Carolingian Empire?
The empire, which united most of Western Europe under a single leader from about 734 until 987, was named for the Carolingians, a family of Frankish kings. After the decline of the Roman Empire, in 476, various Germanic tribes, including the Goths, the Vandals, the Franks, and the Anglo-Saxons, dominated Western Europe, fighting each other as well as the advancing Muslims to protect and expand their territories. In 719, Charles Martel c. 688 to 741, united the lands of all the Franks under his rule. The Franks were the descendants of Germanic tribes who settled in the Rhine River region of Western Europe. He then went on to protect France from Arab incursion and campaigned against the Burgundians and the Frisians, eventually bringing them under his control. Upon his death in 741, Charles Martel was succeeded by his son, Pepin III, known better perhaps as Pepin the Short, c. 714 to 768. It was Pepin who established the Carolingian Empire and brought the Lombards into the empire. Upon his death, he was succeeded by his son Charlemagne, or Charles the Great, 742 to 814.
Who was Euclid?
The Greek mathematician Euclid, 330-270. B. C. Is considered the father of geometry. He used axioms, accepted mathematical truths, to develop a deductive system of proof, which he wrote in his textbook Elements. This book proved to be a great contribution to scientific thinking and includes Euclid's proof of the Pythagorean theorem. Euclid's first three postulates, with which he begins his Elements, are familiar to anyone who has taken geometry. 1. It is possible to draw a straight line between any 2 points. 2. It is possible to produce a finite straight line continuously in a straight line. And 3. A circle may be described with any center and radius.
How did the jitterbug get started?
During the height of swing music's popularity in the late 1930s and early 1940s, there were at least 50 dance bands with national reputations and significant followings. Dance styles such as the jitterbug were based on big band music, the dominant form of American musical entertainment during those decades. The dance itself is a variation of the two-step. Couples swing and twirl in standardized patterns, which sometimes include acrobatics.
How did modern dance begin?
American dancer and choreographer Martha Graham, 1894 to 1991, is the acknowledged creator of modern dance. She was 35 years old when the Martha Graham Dance Group made its debut on April 14, 1929. Ushering in a new era in dance performance. The new form of dance dissolved the separation between mind and body and relied on technique that was built from within. Graham's interest in dance had begun in her youth, and as an astute observer and manipulator of light and space, she came to be regarded later in life as one of the masters of the modernist movement on a par with artist Pablo Picasso, 1881 to 1973. She is credited with revolutionizing dance as an art form. In her hands it had become nonlinear and non-representational theater. Choreographing some 180 works in her lifetime, she also taught many students who rose to prominence as accomplished and masterful dancers, including Merce Cunningham and Paul Taylor.
Why was Alger-Hiss tried?
U.S. public official Alger-Hiss, 1904 to 1996, was tried for perjury during 1949 and 1950. His first trial ended in a hung jury. and the second trial concluded with a guilty verdict and a sentence of 5 years in prison. Hiss served 4 years and 8 months before he was released and returned to private life. To this day many believe Hiss was framed by Republican politicians who charged President Harry Truman's 1884 to 1972 administration with employing communists who acted as secret agents for the Soviet Union. The politically charged case was packed with intrigue, including the testimony of a Time magazine senior editor who was later revealed to be a perjurer and who used at least 7 different aliases in a 14-year period. Microfilm evidence stored in a hollowed-out pumpkin in the middle of a farm field. And an old typewriter, which later evidence and testimony revealed was probably a fake. The case against Hiss was made amidst the investigation of un-American activities of the House of Representatives. It was 1948 and the Cold War was on, distrust was running high. And when a man named Whittaker Chambers, an editor at Time, appeared before the House committee and claimed that Hiss had been a courier who had transported confidential government documents to the Soviets. Hiss, then president of the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, became the subject of investigation. He was indicted and stood trial, in spite of his distinguished career as a public servant. He had served in the State Department for 11 years. A parade of character witnesses who testified of his integrity, loyalty, and veracity, and his own vehement denial of the charges. The prosecution managed to bring enough evidence against him to convince a second jury that Hiss lied when he said the charges that he was a secret agent were a complete fabrication. The jury in Hiss's first trial deadlocked following more than 14 hours of deliberation. Even after his conviction, Hiss's lawyers worked tirelessly to appeal the case. All attempts were denied. In 1957 Hiss published his own account of the case. In the Court of Public Opinion, in which he reasserted his innocence. Then in 1973, during the Watergate hearings, former White House counsel John Dean's 1938, explosive testimony included the statement that he heard President Richard Nixon 1913 to 1994, say, "The typewriters are always the key, we built one in the Hiss case." In 1988 Hiss published again, the book was titled Recollections of a Life. 4 years later, at the age of 87, Hiss appealed to the Russian government to examine their intelligence archives to see what they revealed about him. The response came back that there was not a single document substantiating the allegations that Hiss had collaborated with the Soviet Union's intelligence service. That same year, 1992, Hiss's son, Tony, wrote an article for the New Yorker magazine. It was titled "My Father's Honor."
Who were the brothers Grimm?
The German brothers Jacob, 1785 to 1863, and Wilhelm, 1786 to 1859. Best known for their fairy tales, were actually librarians and professors who studied law. Together wrote a dictionary of the German language, and lectured at universities. In 1805 Jacob traveled to Paris to conduct research on Roman law. And in a library there he found medieval German manuscripts of old stories that were slowly disintegrating. He decided the tales were too valuable to lose, and he vowed to collect them. The brothers' interest in fairy tales also led them to search for old traditions, legends, and tales, especially those meant for children. They traveled the German countryside, interviewing villagers in an effort to gather stories, most of which were from the oral tradition and had never been written down. The brothers were diligent in their efforts, recording everything faithfully so that nothing was added and nothing was left out. When the first volume of Kindrundhausmärchen, literally, the children's household tales, but known better as Grimm's fairy tales, was published in 1812, children loved it. Subsequent volumes were published in German through 1815. The fairy tales collected in the multi-volume work included such classics as The History of Tom Thumb, Little Red Riding Hood, Bluebeard, Puss in Boots, Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, Goldilocks and the Three Bears, The Princess and the Pea, The Sleeping Beauty in the Wood, and Cinderella.
What is Zionism?
Zionism was founded as the nationalist movement to establish an independent Jewish state. It began in the 1890s, and roughly 50 years later, in 1948. The movement's activism resulted in the proclamation of the State of Israel. Since that time, Zionism has focused its efforts on building bridges between Israel and Jewish people around the world. The roots of Zionism date to 1882, when a movement began encouraging Jewish settlement of Palestine. The region in the Middle East, in Southwest Asia, that borders the Mediterranean Sea to the west, Lebanon to the north, Syria and Jordan to the east, and Egypt, the Sinai Peninsula, to the southwest. Groups advocating immigration to the Jewish homeland in Palestine called themselves Lovers of Zion. Hovevei Zion. Mount Zion is the site in Jerusalem where the Temple of David, king of the ancient Hebrews, d. 962 BC, was built, and it is therefore considered the center of Jewish spiritual life. As a political movement, Zionism was founded in the late 1890s by Austrian journalist Theodor Herzl, 1860 to 1904. In 1894 Herzl was among the reporters covering the trial of Alfred Dreyfus, a French army officer falsely convicted of treason. Though the artillery captain, who was Jewish, was later declared innocent. The guilty verdict rendered in his first trial was annulled. Many felt the Dreyfus case had exposed a deep vein of anti-Semitism in Europe. Herzl's conclusion was that if anti-Semitism could take hold in France, it could prevail anywhere. Based on this belief, he began working for the reclamation of a Jewish State in the Middle East. In 1897 Herzl convened the First Zionist Congress. Held in Basel, Switzerland, bringing the movement to worldwide attention. In 1917, against the backdrop of World War I, 1914-18, British Foreign Secretary Arthur James Balfour. 1848-1930, issued a declaration vowing his country's support for a national Jewish homeland in Palestine. This came after British troops liberated the Middle East from the control of the Ottoman Empire. In 1920 the Ottoman Empire dissolved as part of the conclusion of World War I, and by international agreement the British were given rule over Palestine. Numerous Jews immigrated to Palestine, where fighting broke out with Arabs who opposed Jewish resettlement. Previously boosted by British support of an independent Jewish state, Zionists received a heavy blow in 1937 when, with another conflict in Europe on the horizon, Britain reversed its policy in Palestine in an effort to gain Arab support should fighting break out with Germany. At the end of World War II, 1939-45, Britain turned over the problem in the Middle East to the newly created United Nations, which decided that out of Palestine, both an independent Jewish state and a self-ruling Arab state should be formed. In 1948 the State of Israel was declared by Polish-born and Zionist moderate David Ben-Gurion. 1886-1973, who became head of the nation's provisional government. The World Zionist Congress was later separated from the government. The organization has since turned its attention to immigration and cultural activities. German-born scientist Albert Einstein, 1897-1955, was among Zionism's most prominent adherents.
What is the basis of the conflict over the Gaza Strip and the West Bank?
The conflict is rooted in Jewish and Arab claims to the same lands in the Palestine region, which was under British control between 1917 and 1947. The Gaza Strip is a tiny piece of territory along the eastern Mediterranean Sea and adjacent to Egypt. After the nation of Israel was established and boundaries were determined by the United Nations (UN), in 1947, the Gaza Strip bounded on two sides by the new Israel came under Egyptian control. The Arab-Israeli War of 1967 resulted in Israeli takeover and occupation of Gaza. But unrest continued, and in 1987 and 1988 the region was the site of Arab uprisings known as the Intifada. A historic accord between the Palestine Liberation Organization, PLO, and Israel, signed in May 1994, provided for Palestinian self-rule in the Gaza Strip. This has been in effect since, though peace in the region remains elusive, as extremists on both sides of the conflict stage sporadic acts of violence. The West Bank, which does not neighbor the Gaza Strip, is an area on the east of Israel, along the Jordan River and Dead Sea. The West Bank includes the towns of Jericho, Bethlehem, and Hebron. The holy city of Jerusalem is situated on the shared border between Israel and the West Bank. by the UN mandate that established the independent Jewish state of Israel in 1948. The West Bank area was supposed to become Palestinian. But Arabs who were unhappy with the UN agreement in the first place attacked Israel. And Israel responded by occupying the West Bank. A 1950 truce brought the West Bank under the control of neighboring Jordan. This situation lasted until 1967, when Israeli forces again occupied the region. Israelis soon began establishing settlements there, which provoked the resentment of Arabs. The Intifada uprisings that began in the Gaza Strip in 1987 soon spread to the West Bank. In 1988 Jordan relinquished its claim to the area. But fighting between the PLO and Israeli troops continued. Peace talks began in 1991, and the agreements that provided for Palestinian self-rule in the Gaza Strip also provided for the gradual return of West Bank lands to Palestinians. The city of Jericho was the first of these lands. In August 2005 Israel began pulling out of the Gaza Strip after 38 years of occupation. Some Israeli settlers resisted Prime Minister Ariel Sharon's call for withdrawal. But Sharon insisted the move was a critical step toward peace and securing Israel's future.
What was the impact of the accident at 3 Mile Island?
Prior to the March 1979 events at 3 Mile Island, it was thought that the danger of a nuclear meltdown was almost negligible. Though there were safety systems in place, none of them would have prevented a complete catastrophe. Since the accident, the American Nuclear Regulatory Commission, NRC, and utility companies have worked together to resolve the problems that were revealed. Among the efforts and requirements put into place were, more stringent licensing procedures for operators, better training of plant operators in the event of an emergency, wider sharing of information on emergency management systems, effort to locate new plants outside of densely populated areas, more rigid quality assurance standards at all plants, strict implementation of the standards, which are subject to review by the NRC, and emergency evacuation plans that must be approved by the Federal Emergency Management Agency, FEMA. Even with these improvements to safety programs, the accident at Chernobyl in 1986 again produced worldwide concern over the hazards of nuclear power.
Wade controversial?
The 1973 Supreme Court decision in the case of Roe v. Wade legalized abortion in the United States and has probably engendered more public controversy than any other legal decision of the late 20th century. Women's access to safe abortion continues to be the subject of debate. At issue in legal cases, and has inspired overzealous anti-abortion activists to violence against doctors who perform abortions and office workers in women's health clinics. The 7 Supreme Court justices who issued the majority decision became the recipients of thousands of letters of hatred, some of them threatening. The case was brought as a class action suit, representing all pregnant women. By 21-year-old Norma McCorvey, 1947. Who has since the ruling reversed her feeling and joined the anti-abortion camp as a right-to-life advocate. But in 1969, under the alias Jane Roe, McCorvey claimed that Texas's abortion law, on the books since 1859, violated her constitutional rights and those of other women. The other party named in the case was Texas District Attorney Henry B. Wade, 1914 to 2001, who argued to uphold Texas state law that punished anyone who gave an abortion. Despite the fact that the ruling in the case would do nothing to help McCorvey, for whom even a favorable decision would come too late to end her unwanted pregnancy, her lawyers, Linda Coffey and Sarah Weddington, agreed to pursue the case as a test. The crux of the plaintiff's case is best summed up by arguments made before the Supreme Court, when in December 1971, Weddington argued that Texas's ability to compel women to bear children infringed on a woman's right to control her own life. It was therefore a violation of the Constitution, the 14th Amendment, which forbids states to make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens. In response to defense claims that the fetus is entitled to protection, Weddington averred, "The Constitution as I read it, attaches protection to the person at the time of birth." These arguments, and those of the defense, were presented twice to the Supreme Court. After the first presentation, the 7 justices then seated concluded that such an important decision should not be made until the 2 newly appointed justices could participate. In October 1972 the case was heard again. As it turned out, the 2 new judges represented 1 majority vote and 1 dissenting vote. The majority decision was read by Justice Harry Blackmun on January 22, 1973. The High Court overturned all state laws restricting women's access to abortions. The decision was based on the court's opinion that existing laws banning abortions had been enacted to protect the health of American women, since abortion had previously been a risky medical procedure, and that with advances in medicine this protection was no longer necessary or valid. The court also agreed that the Constitution's implied right to privacy, as found in the 14th Amendment's concept of personal liberty, or in the 9th Amendment's reservation of rights to the people, is broad enough to encompass a woman's decision to terminate her pregnancy. 2 justices dissented in the opinion, with Justice Byron White writing that the court had sustained a position that values the convenience, whim or caprice of the putative mother more than life or the potential life of the fetus. Nearly 3 decades after the landmark decision, opinion continues to divide along such lines.
What is the legacy of ancient Rome?
Since the Romans borrowed and adapted the ideas of the Greeks, with whom they had come into contact about 300 B.C. and later conquered in 146 BC. The culture of ancient Rome is sometimes called Greco-Roman. Over the course of centuries, Romans spread their ideas throughout their vast empire. They also developed a legal code, which outlined basic principles while remaining flexible enough that lawyers and judges could interpret the laws, taking into consideration local customs and practices. The code later became the model for legal systems in Europe and in Latin America. Further, Roman armies built a network of roads, aqueducts, and tunnels, putting in place an infrastructure that outlasted the empire itself. Latin, the Roman language, remained the language of educated Europeans for more than 1,000 years. While the Latin-based, or Romance, languages of Italian, French, and Spanish took over everyday communication. The economic system put in place during the height of the Roman Empire, with a centrally controlled money supply, also had lasting effect. Though the empire crumbled by AD 476, its cultural, social, and economic establishments continued to have validity well into the Middle Ages, 500-1350.
How was the Soviet Union formed?
The Soviet Union was officially created in 1922 when Russia joined with Ukraine, Belarus, and the Transcaucasian Federation, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Georgia, to form the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, USSR. These republics were later joined by 9 others, and territories were redrawn so that by 1940, the Union consisted of 15 Soviet Socialist Republics, Armenia, Azerbaijan, Belarus, now Belarus, Estonia, Georgia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyz, now Kyrgyzstan, Latvia, Lithuania, Moldavia, now Moldova, Russia, Tajikistan, also spelled Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Ukraine, and Uzbekistan.
What effect did the sinking of the Titanic have on sea travel?
The sinking of the Titanic brought about new regulations to increase the safety of sea travel. First, and perhaps most simply, all ships are required to carry enough lifeboats such that there is one spot for each person on board. When Titanic sailed, the number of required lifeboats was based on the ship's tonnage, not on the number of passengers and crew. Also, new rules required lifeboat drills to be held soon after a ship sails. Shipping lanes were moved farther south, away from the ice fields, and are monitored by a patrol. Ships approaching ice fields are required to slow their speed or alter their course. Until 1912, most ships employed only one wireless operator. Such was the case on the California, which was less than 20 miles from Titanic when wireless operator Jack Phillips sent out the distress signal. However, the operator on the California was not on duty at that hour. Philip stayed at his station, desperately trying to reach a nearby ship, and eventually went down with Titanic. In the aftermath of the disaster, the U.S. Congress moved quickly to pass the Radio Act of 1912, which required that radios be manned day and night, that they have an alternate energy source besides the ship's engine, and that they have a range of at least 100 miles. Further, operators must be licensed, adhere to certain bandwidths, and observe a strict protocol for receiving distress signals. This was the beginning of the Federal Communications Commission, or FCC. These measures were meant to rid the airwaves of those amateur operators who had confused official operators the night of April 15, 1912. One erroneous wireless message transmitted by amateurs that night had the Titanic moving safely toward Halifax, Nova Scotia.
What was the impact of the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan?
When the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan in December 1979 to bolster a pro-communist government in the Middle Eastern nation, no one could have anticipated the far-reaching effects that would be felt decades later and around the globe. What immediately followed was a 10-year civil war, in which Soviet troops fought Afghan guerrillas, or the Mujahideen. The war in Afghanistan became a jihad, or holy war, and a rallying point for many Muslims, with the conflict drawing young men from across the Muslim world to fight on the side of the guerrillas. According to the 9/11 Commission report, mosques, schools, and boarding houses served as recruiting stations in many parts of the world, including the United States. The war was a virtual stalemate for 7 years. But a turning point came in 1986 after the United States and Great Britain supplied shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles to the Afghan guerrillas. The weaponry gave the scrubby ground forces a fighting chance against Soviet air power. As the 9/11 Commission report asserts, together with Saudi Arabia, the United States supplied billions of dollars worth of secret assistance to rebel Afghan groups resisting the Soviet occupation. Thus supported, in April 1988 the Afghans declared victory. And early the next year the Soviet troops began to withdraw. The war was over, but it had fueled an extremist Islamic ideology, the jihad as holy war, and put into place an infrastructure out of which emerged a powerful and deadly terrorist network. Though most Muslims hold peaceful views, a minority of Muslims view any non-Muslims as unbelievers. It was from this minority, trained and financed as a result of the Afghan war, that the global network of terrorists called Al-Qaeda emerged.